Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining Advanced CTE's webinar. My name is Kevin Johnson. I'm a senior advisor here at Advanced CTE, and thank you for joining our webinar today on examining the potential of industry recognized credential in high school to advanced learner success. So with us today are our guest speakers. Our guest speakers today are Mr. Matt Giani. He's a research associate professor at UT Austin. We also have Warren Kawano. He is Career Pathways Strategy Director, University of Hawaii, Hawaii P20 Partnerships for Education. We have Trey Michael, Senior Director, Office of Career and Technical Education, North Carolina Department of Public Instruction. And we have Amber Northern, Senior Vice President for Research, Thomas B. Ford Institute. So, and what we want to do for today is one, allow Matt and Amber to share the research sponsored by the Fordham Institute. And with that, we're also going to ask you, as you go through the session, please put your questions at any time in the chat, and we will definitely address those during the panel section of today's webinar, and also during the Q&A session that's scheduled for today's webinar. But we would like to, at this point, get an idea to see who's in the room. So with that, we're going to launch a poll, and that poll is going to ask you for your response, and it's just get an idea of our audience for today. So with that being said, Tanya, do you mind launching the poll? Excellent. And we'll give you a few moments to respond. Thank you. I see hello from Tennessee. And just a reminder, please respond to the poll. And that way we have an idea of who's in the audience. And we will continue from there. So in an attempt to ensure that we have plenty of time to, one, have our researchers present their information and allow for some responses from the state directors and the state agency representatives that are here, I am at this time going to turn over today's webinar practice or webinar to Mr. Matt Giani and Ms. Amber Northern.
All right, Matt, I'm up first. Thumbs up, yes? Thumbs up. All right, welcome everybody. We are super excited to have such a strong showing on this webinar. I hope we can, fulfill all your needs and desires out of the information you're looking for. I'm just going to start real quickly with I asked before we started, am I going to insult people if I actually give them a definition of IRCs? And I was told just go for it. So for those of you on the call who are thinking, okay, what exactly are we talking about here? These are obviously credentials that are conferred by businesses or industry groups or state certifying entities to individuals, and they have to demonstrate a sufficient level of knowledge or skills in a particular domain or industry. And usually they have to demonstrate that mastery of skills through one or more assessments. So that's what we're talking about here. Some states, they're called IBCs. I think IRCs and IBCs are the main name, industry recognized or industry based. But we're talking about the same thing here. So for instance, in the welding, American Welding Society actually has various certifications in inspection or engineering or education and sales. And those are all, again, different credentials. So we know that more than half of states have, they include K-12 industry recognized credentials in their state accountability systems. So again, the idea of IRCs being able to attain those at the high school level is really taking off across the country. Why the need for IRCs? Let me run through these really quickly. We know that tuition is costing more and more. Those of you on the call who are parents know this reality. I mean, obviously, post-secondary education is extremely important for kids and career prospects. But we also know that, sometimes we can, you need to do the math, and these escalation of tuition is a real problem for kids and families. I think at the last time I looked, the average federal student loan debt is close to $38,000 to $40,000 per borrower. And another stat I ran across recently is 20 years after entering school, half of student borrowers still owe $20,000. So this is debt that is sticking around. And we know, again, that in terms of the COVID and its impact on college enrollment, it's actually dropped by over 9% we saw during the pandemic of kids who were, deciding not to go to college yet. Maybe they were going to wait. We know the pandemic threw college enrollment and attendance into a whirlwind. We also know that research is showing that there's significant variation in pay across the country. Fordham did a study not too long ago that showed that it depended where you lived in terms of whether a 4-year degree or a 2-year degree, or whether training in particular fields might actually pay you more. So for instance, if you live in North Dakota and you plan to stay there, it may make sense for you to weigh the pros and cons of attending a 4-year college versus an associate's degree or a training technical degree, because you actually make only 14% less in North Dakota if you have an associate's versus a 4-year degree. So we do know that some of these more rural states, West Virginia, Oklahoma, Mississippi, that are dependent more with an economy dependent on natural resources, they actually get paid relatively similarly, I'll say, with the 2 or 4-year degrees or the technical degrees. So more and more folks are realizing that these can be beneficial credentials and degrees to get. Many kids aren't prepared for college. You guys have seen the statistics like I have, particularly the ACT does these readiness indicators, and we find that only 32% of graduates in the last year who took the ACT met many of their three of the college readiness indicators out of 4. So very few people are meeting all of those readiness indicators. So we know that kids just, they don't have what it takes sometimes to be prepared for college. That's a failure on many levels, but that's not the purpose of this conversation. And then we know that dropout rates and student debt, again, I already mentioned that, are rising. I think the last time I was looking at it earlier, 14% of those enrolled in a bachelor's degree and 38% of those in an associate's degree program actually finished their studies in 6 years. So more and more kids, just aren't making it through a 2-year or a 4-year college. I mean, that doesn't mean that, we need to throw in the towel on these kids, but it does mean that we need to do a lot better job preparing kids who are both choosing to go straight into the labor market after high school, who are headed directly to college, or who are looking for high school to prepare them and give them a stepping stone into a strong trade or industry. So that's what we're looking at here. My last bullet is, when we look at survey data, kids are telling us they're not learning job ready skills in high school. So we're seeing a devaluing of the high school degree on multiple levels. All right, looking ahead real quickly, Matt's going to circle back to this, but this is sort of just a little highlight of what we're going to be talking about later. I'm kind of a firm believer in, tell people what you're going to tell them and then tell them again. So we're going to circle back to this, but one of the questions we want to talk about is how we transform the high school experience. We need to boost wages. We need to boost the career prospects of kids once they're in the workforce. And we've been talking about redesigning high school for a long time. And so, okay, what does it mean? Because as Matt's going to present to you, there are some pros of the IRCs, the impacts, but there are some places we see that are of concern. That there's a lot of room of improvement in how we implement IRCs. So few ideas, again, and these aren't new to the folks on this call, but stress the role of high schools and middle schools in helping kids to figure out their career interests and aptitudes. We're seeing more and more of this exploration occur at the middle school level, which is helpful because by the time kids get to high school, they have a better idea of what their interests are, what their capabilities and aptitudes are. So we need to see this happen earlier. We talk about embracing approaches that are more ambitious than IRCs because honestly, as we're going to see, there's going to be some drawbacks here. And often states are trying these more serious youth apprenticeship programs where kids are getting, hooked up with promising pathways. and they're working in real industries, learning applicable skills. And so we do have models for where for these strong youth apprenticeship programs that often embed an IRC in them, but again, are launching kids on a little stronger footing than an IRC alone. Encouraging stackable credentials. Again, this is a phrase we hear often, but in our research, we found, that kids often weren't majoring in the same field that they received an IRC in. So if we have this idea that they're going to stack on it in 2 or 4 year college, it's not often happening that way. So we need to have a much better idea of which industries and degrees lend themselves to stacking, where kids can continue to increase the level of preparation and know-how, and which industries don't stack all too well. We know that, for instance, health science tends to stack a little bit better than a retail trade or something of that nature. And then finally, what we'll touch on is that these state accountability systems, they need to be more selective. When we started looking across the country, we see that many states are giving the same amount of credit, so to speak, to a Microsoft Office, IRC or an OSHA safety IRC than they are to, one that's an IT in drafting for an engineering STEM degree. So we all know that an IRC is not all these aren't created equally. And so I think that we need to have those conversations in terms of, are we incentivizing quality, or we incentivize quantity over quality in some state accountability systems. So that gives you a taste, a lot of good stuff we're going to talk about, but I'm going to let Matt actually present the data and the findings.
Sounds great. Well, thank you, Amber, and thanks to all of you who are here today. It's a privilege, and this is a labor of love that I've been working on for quite some time, so I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to share the findings with you all. This is the full report, which we'll also make available, so you have access to it. I'm just going to give a very brief overview and then really dive into the findings of the study. So what allowed this study to happen is that the Texas Education Agency started producing a list of industry recognized certifications, or IBCs as they're called in Texas, that were approved for state accountability purposes. And schools and districts started collecting student level data on IRC receipt and sharing it with TEA for the first time beginning in about 2017. So I used data from Texas's statewide longitudinal data system to really examine who earns these certifications and what are their outcomes. I looked at 3 cohorts of high school graduates, those who graduated between 2017 and 2019, which was about 1 million students in Texas, which has about 350,000 high school graduates every year. And I examined both the predictors of IRC receipt, how do student characteristics and school characteristics shape who earns a certification, as well as how IRCs shape employment and college outcomes. And I don't highlight these findings too much in this presentation, but I supplement the quantitative findings with some interviews and focus groups with students participating in CTE programs. And there are some really great vignettes in the report that give you a sense of how students are experiencing and thinking about these programs. So you may ask, well, what do certifications look like in Texas? This is just a figure showing the percentage of high school graduates who earn certifications in different fields. As you can see, health science was the most popular, followed by business, manufacturing, construction, and so forth. As Amber mentioned, the business certification area or subject was mostly Microsoft Office. So these are Microsoft Excel type certifications. And in contrast to those areas, fields like IT, hospitality, education are still quite rare in terms of students earning certifications. So there's lots of variation across subjects. So I'm now going to turn to the findings, but instead of just kind of spewing all of the findings at you fire hose style, I thought I'd try something a little different, which is I'm going to ask you a question and give you some response options and just give you a few seconds to think about what do you think the answer is. And then after that, I'll show you what we found. So the first question is, how much do IRCs help students find jobs? The outcome here is, did a student find employment within the first 12 months after graduating from high school? So not at all, a little, a moderate amount, or a lot. If you guessed not at all, You are correct. That's what we found in Texas, at least. When we controlled for everything else we knew about students, the courses they took, their demographic backgrounds, their test scores, the school they graduated from, we found that there wasn't much relationship between students earning certification and their likelihood of being employed. We don't have data on hours of employment in Texas, so perhaps students with certifications are working more hours, but just whether they were employed or not, we didn't see much relationship. So the next question, how much do IRCs boost earnings? Same response options from not at all to a lot. And this time the outcome is how much did students make their first year after graduating from high school? In this case, we actually find a moderate amount. So this was somewhat unexpected given that we didn't find much benefit in terms of employment. But in fact, students who earn certifications did tend to earn significantly more than observably equivalent students who did not earn certifications. And some of the largest estimates, apart from education, which only had about 30 students who earned that certification and were employed, but for certifications in fields like cosmetology, transportation, information technology, health science, and so forth, there was about a 10 to 20% increase in earnings for students who earned those certifications. And many of those estimates were statistically significant. So we actually find some evidence that these certifications do indeed promote students' initial labor market outcomes. However, if you're familiar with research on vocational education, particularly kind of historical research, you may be familiar with concerns about tracking and certain populations of students being funneled into specific pathways that are less valuable or don't support their transition into college or careers as effectively. So one thing we wanted to look at is how equal is this benefit of IRCs across demographic groups, from very unequal to very equal. What would you guess? If you hypothesized very unequal, I would not have been surprised because that's what I guessed. But in fact, it was very equal. So this figure shows the estimated earnings benefit of completing a certification for different student populations based on special populations, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, gender. And an interesting finding is that even though there are some differences across student demographic groups in terms of the types of certifications or the types of CTE fields in which students specialize or concentrate, we find that the estimated earnings benefit is actually very equivalent across groups. It's about 8 or 9% for all the demographic groups that we analyzed. So in fact, the benefit seems to be very equivalent across populations. Okay, so we've talked about labor market outcomes. What about college? How do IRCs relate to students' likelihood of going to college? Would you expect a large decrease, a small increase, or a large increase? We find a small increase. Once again, if you're familiar with historical research, there's some that suggest that CTE programs either divert students from 4-year colleges to 2-year colleges or result in students not pursuing higher education at all. But in fact, that's not what we find. We find that students who earn certifications are more likely to go to college. It's not a huge difference. It's about 1 percentage point, but nevertheless, it is positive and statistically significant. And we also find that students who earn certifications are more likely to persist from their first year to their second year of college among the population of students who enrolled in college their first year. So although students who earn certifications perhaps could have dropped out at higher rates because they had better labor market opportunities, they didn't need to persist in higher education, that's not what we found. We found that certifications were positively related to college persistence. Okay, so we've talked about the kind of overall college and career benefits of some of these certifications. The next question is, how aligned are IRCs with students' college majors and jobs? From very misaligned to somewhat misaligned, somewhat aligned, or very aligned. If you guessed very aligned, you are very wrong, because they are very misaligned, in fact. So this figure shows of students who earned certifications in a specific subject, what percentage of those students were majoring in an aligned major, right? In the kind of same major in the field that they earned the certification in. And the highest rate was still only about 38% for public safety, about 31% for health science. But for many of the fields, it's much lower than that. So another way to say it is that the majority of students who earn a certification study something different in college. This is the figure for college majors. It's a pretty similar figure when we look at first year industry of employment. There's not a ton of alignment. The majority of students are working in food service and the retail sector. They're not working in jobs that are aligned with their certifications. Whether that's an okay thing, a good thing, a terrible thing, we can debate, and I think we should have that discussion, but nevertheless, we don't see much alignment. Okay, the last question that I'll ask the audience. What factor most strongly shapes which students earn IRCs? We have an expanded menu of options. We have 8 options here: race, ethnicity, SES, gender, disability status, test scores, coursework, the school students attend, and geography, such as whether they were in a rural or urban or suburban context. And I'll just say, we asked this question to members of state boards of education when we presented some of these findings at NASB, and they were very accurate in their decisions. So we'll see what y'all think. But if you guessed the school students attend, that is correct. So in statistical models estimating this, schools explain like 50 to 80% of the variation in who earns IRCs. Okay, what does that mean? When we look at national data and estimate how much schools influence academic achievement, we find schools explain about 20% of the variation in student achievement. Student characteristics explain the other 80%. So student characteristics or between student differences are way more important than school differences when we're looking at academic achievement. In this case, when we're looking at who earns IRCs, schools are way more important. They explain the vast majority of variation in who earns certifications. So the natural next question is, well, what is it about schools? What school characteristics are associated with the IRC rate? And to be honest, at this point, I don't know. I can tell you school demographics don't seem to matter much. I've looked at that. School achievement doesn't seem to matter much. I've looked at that. And I've even looked at whether the school is a specific school model, like an early college high school, a T-STEM academy, a P-TECH school. The IRC rate doesn't vary much across those school models either. So I really don't know at this point why schools matter so much. But just to show you how much variation there is, this figure shows the IRC rate at the school level and kind of puts all schools just in order in terms of their distribution of their IRC rate. So the 50th percentile is like the median school. The average school in Texas has about 1.3% of their high school graduates earning a certification, and 40% of schools had 0 students earn a certification during this time period. At the other end of the spectrum, in this like 95th percentile, the top 5% of schools, almost 1 out of every 5 students are earning a certification. And in the school with the highest rate, it's almost 2/3. Right? 64% of all students at that school earned a certification. So we see really tremendous variation in the school's IRC rate, and we need to know why that's the case. So these findings are not included in the report that I shared with you. These are some things I've been working on after that. So I've been working on some supplemental analysis of school level metrics included in Texas's advanced performance reports. So these are like school level reports that include a bunch of metrics, many of which get factored into school accountability ratings. And this figure shows trends in 3 of those metrics: the percentage of high school graduates earning industry certifications, the percentage of graduates completing CTE coursework aligned with certifications, and college-ready graduates. So in Texas, students are considered college ready if they score above certain thresholds on standardized tests, or they complete a dual credit course, or do a number of other things. So what you can see is that both the IBC rate and the rate of students completing aligned CTE coursework has really increased considerably over this time period, much faster than the increase for college-ready graduates. So it seems as though schools are really strongly responding to this policy and changing the curricular opportunities available to students, expanding access to CTE coursework, and of course, expanding access to certifications as well. However, when we look at the actual transcript data, this figure shows the percentage of high school students each year who either take dual credit courses, because that's one indicator of college readiness, versus CTE courses, which are shown in the blue dots. We actually find not much change in the percentage of students taking CTE courses over the time frame when these accountability policies went into effect. So what you're seeing here is that there wasn't as much change in dual credit course taking for the first few years, but then it trended up a little bit between like 2016 and 2019, when many of these college readiness and career readiness policies went into effect in Texas. In contrast, for CTE course taking, you actually see more increase between 2013 and 2016. But from 2017 to 2019, the percentage of students taking CTE courses actually hasn't changed that much. And the average credits that they're completing hasn't changed much either. So we see somewhat of a discrepancy between, in some measures, it seems like CTE is being expanded, the percentage of students taking aligned CTE coursework is really increasing. On the other hand, we don't see the exact same findings when we look at some of the underlying course transcript data. Once again, I don't know why this is, but I'll share this last finding before we move to the discussion. This last figure looks at the relationship between students earning certifications in the field of that certification and whether they concentrated in that same CTE area. And as you can see, there's not always a lot of alignment. In fields like health science and cosmetology, the vast majority of students who are earning those certifications are also concentrating in that field, right? As you would kind of expect based on programs of study and coherent sequences of courses and so forth. But in other fields like construction, manufacturing, business, the majority of students earning those certifications are not concentrating in the same CTE area. There seems to be a disconnect between students earning the certifications and the curricular pathways that they're actually completing. I'm very curious to hear everyone's thoughts about why that might be and what we can learn by continuing this research. So I'll just conclude with a few final points before opening it up. I do want to just underscore the top line finding, which is that IRCs do provide a modest and very equivalent earnings boost across demographic groups without strongly deterring students from college. That's a really important finding, and I don't want to lose sight of it because it is really critical. However, are IRCs game changers? Do they substantially transform students' labor market outcomes? Probably not. Should we let all IRCs count equivalently in state policy, as Amber alluded to before? Probably not. There seems to be variation in the benefits. And the question that I've been thinking a lot about is, should we consider students to be career ready because they earned an IRC? I would personally say probably not. I don't know if just receiving an IRC is sufficient for us to say that a student is ready for their career. I didn't present it here, but another finding I'll just mention is that the majority of students who earn certifications or not are still making close to poverty level wages their first year out of high school. So are these students career ready? I don't know. I would probably fall on the side of no, not quite. Finally, do we need more research on IRCs? Probably not. Just kidding. Yes, we definitely do need more research on IRCs. I'm very anxious to hear about all the research going on in your states, and hopefully we can discuss ways to collaborate to continue this line of research. So thanks, that's all I had, and we'll now, I believe, open it up for our panel discussion. So thank you.
Thank you, Matt. And what I would like to do is provide our two speakers, Trey and Warren, an opportunity. And Trey, well, we'll actually start with Warren in Hawaii. Warren, please just introduce yourself, give us your title again, and your response to the research, and then we'll turn it over to Trey.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you for having me today. My name is Warren Kawano. I am the Career Pathway Strategy Director in what is known as our Office of Hawaii P20. We serve as the state CTE office, as the Office of the State Director. So IRCs in Hawaii have been a huge thing of recent. There's a lot of legislation around it. And I think some of my initial reactions was, one, the value of the credential. So one thing that we're dealing with a lot here in our communications with our schools is that which credentials are good for students to do in high school because they show a level of skill attainment versus which ones are valuable in industry. And how do we differentiate the two? Like, for example, I have this question all the time, like QuickBooks, where accounting is a highly demanded skill, but the credential itself is not demanded. Kind of similar to Microsoft Office. You got to have Office, but you don't necessarily need to have the Office credential. So how do we actually put some parameters on which ones are valuable? So in 2020, in the middle of the pandemic, our office commissioned a report we call the Promising Credentials Report. It's in the chat there. And we are currently revising it, and we'll be publishing a revision in the next month or so. But what we did is we tried to figure out of these thousands of credentials out there, which ones had the most value. So what we did first is align it to what we call promising occupations that met wage and demand thresholds, and then use labor market data through EMSI at that time to determine which credentials were associated with those promising occupations, right? Which ones our employers are asking for through job ads, right? To try and give a sense of value. And in that report, we kind of categorized it into different categories, which we are now modifying a little bit, in which we're saying these are credentials that high school education is enough to get a job. These are like foundational credentials versus ones that are typically associated with an associate's degree or associated with a bachelor's degree. So employers are asking for the IRC plus a bachelor's degree to get some of these jobs. Keep in mind that that's super broad, right? Like it's so many jobs out there. Everyone's a little bit different. But how do we put some value? And now we narrowed it down to about 140 in Hawaii, which causes a lot of friction between our high school partners because they're not offering these. And these typically are high level because they're associated with well-paying jobs. So I've trying to work with our state to figure out how do we determine which ones are good for them to have, like good to do in high school because you're learning a skill and you can verify that skill when you don't have any work experience. That's great. But communicating to students what that value is of that credential. And I think that's the hard part that I hear over and over in the chat is that, I see some of the comments is, well, they're not that valuable. They're not aligned to labor market needs. And how do we actually communicate that to our students so they know what they can do with it? Another thing we talked about the degree versus going to college and the IRCs. We recently commissioned an IT workforce study to really take a look at our IT industry. And what we found is that although employers are listing minimum requirements like an IRC, maybe an IRC plus an associate's, that's not who they hire in those jobs. So we looked at people who are getting hired into those jobs with those minimum requirements, and it's all those with bachelor's degrees. And in our focus group findings, we found that employers tend to use a bachelor's degree as a proxy for employability skills or soft skills. Whether that's right, maybe it's a communication issue, but that's the reality, at least in Hawaii right now, is IRCs alone are technically not enough to necessarily get you that job. And one last thing I want to point out, that school they attended, we see that a lot in Hawaii in terms of whether or not they earn IRC. In Hawaii, we are moving towards a heavy academy presence. So the National Career Academy Coalition, NCAC, we have about half of our public high schools following that model. And in that, they push IRCs from an early time, whether it's like a OSHA 10 to a first aid to something like Cisco or CCNA A+ certifications. Those are something being pushed systematically at the school level. So you'll see a lot higher attainment of those at our academy schools versus our non-academy schools. So that might be something that the research has shown that it's not necessarily the achievement, but more the culture and the structure of the school that lends itself to IRC attainment. That's my initial thoughts. So, I think it's Trey.
Thank you, Warren. It sounds like that even though we're a few thousand miles apart, we're facing a lot of the same issues. And So it's good to know that we have company in like kind. But you know, I love the research. I think it's incredibly valuable, but I'm not surprised at some of the results, honestly. To kind of look back at some of the first data points that were shared, where we're noticing that children are earning IRCs, but not really related to the degree paths that they choose. You know, I kind of tend to believe that there's still a fair amount of what I would call exploration in high school. You know, real quick sidebar, I coach 15-year-old girls in soccer on the weekends, and just now having conversations with them about their courses and what they're planning to take. And they seem to be taking very much a buckshot approach still today, even though we've had a lot of emphasis on concentrators, which I'll come back to in a little while. But I think as we improve our middle school structure, and we're focusing very heavily on that in North Carolina, as we improve the offerings that we have in middle school, particularly around the trades, where there's not a lot of middle school offerings in the trades and in healthcare, and some of the deeper IT and computer science, I think we'll see a little bit better focus over the next 5 to 10 years as we think about career planning and leveraging better models in middle school. And I would like to add that North Carolina has worked really hard, segueing a little bit. North Carolina's worked really hard to realign our values for industry rated recognized credentials relative to the bonus structure that we offer. I think every state's facing this. I think there's something like 1 million credentials actually on one of those lists that gets published. You have to really sift through the weeds to think about which ones are really important to your local industry, which ones are important to your regional and state industries as well. So we've worked very hard to realign our value for each credential relative to the bonuses. We work with our Department of Commerce, who helps us analyze that through labor and economic analysis. We focused more or less on Microsoft in particular, whereas 10 years ago, we were earning thousands of those. We're into much smaller numbers now, and really focusing more on Revit, ASE, Adobe, Python, nursing fundamentals, et cetera. And I just wanted to say real quickly, we're very lucky too. I know she's not on the panel, but our section chief that has done much of this work, Linda Lay, is also on this call. She's one of the attendees, and she's been instrumental in helping us do all of this work. So didn't want to miss saying thank you to her as well.
And excellent. But before we move to some of the panel questions, Matt, I want to give you or Amber an opportunity to respond to Warren and Trey's comments.
Amber, you want to go?
I was just going to point out that it's one of the points Warren made is a point we made in the sort of our front matter to the report, which is we think of these as a stepping stone. You know, I mean, to expect that an IRC is going to completely prepare, you know, a student to enter the workplace and succeed and excel is, you know, it's not exactly realistic. So if we can temper, you know, our expectations and see it as a solid stepping stone, I think that would be helpful for everyone in terms of how they think about these.
Yeah, and I guess just the one thought that I think is so critical is just this question of alignment, which both of y'all mentioned a bit, and the idea of like, should students be in these very structured programs of study that have the IRCs attached to them, or should we expect a little bit of exploration and such? And it's a really difficult question, both kind of theoretically, from a policy question, pragmatically. But I guess my at least hesitation is that there's nothing wrong with students exploring different pathways, right? I think that's high school is the time for that. It's a better time to do it than to be in a very structured pathway and then realize you don't want to do that after you graduate high school and then you have to start from scratch. At the same time, it seems like the value of IRCs would be maximized if you're also taking the aligned coursework, right? So I don't think there's anything wrong with students taking a diversity of CTE courses and exploring different subjects and fields. I think that's great. But I wonder if the value of IRCs is limited if you combine a certification in a particular area with just a scatter shot of courses without that, particularly the like development of the higher order skills, in Texas, I think we have like level 1, level 2, level 3 courses, right? So if you're just staying at the kind of basics across multiple disciplines, and then you get a random certification, I don't think that's an optimal outcome. So I do wonder how we can combine a bit of exploration with still ensuring students are getting that coherent sequence of course where the IRC is aligned with all the other knowledge they're gaining from their coursework.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Amber. Warren, I'm just going to give you the first question. And the first one is, how have schools in Hawaii responded to take K-12 accountability policies that incentivize the completion of IRCs and align CTE coursework?
Well, I think we're in the infancy of it right now. The legislation just passed last year, and the DOE has been scrambling to figure out how do we collect this data, what data counts, what doesn't count. I think I mentioned in a comment before, we don't have an approved list. The Promising Credentials report sort of became a pseudo approved list based on how other legislation was focused or written. But right now we're still figuring all that out. I mean, and I think it's going to take some time for us to really improve on that. I think the incentives was really trying to incentivize the highest level first. And if there's money left in the bank, then you can pay out the lower ones. But even the lower ones seem to be quite difficult for some of our schools. I mean, and I think the question is whether or not those are appropriate in high school, or whether we should push our high schools to raise their level to meet some of these, and if that best serves them. So we're kind of very new, and there's a lot of questions all the time around that.
And Trey, I'll pose the same question to you. How have schools responded in North Carolina to the K-12 accountability policies that incentivize the completion of IRCs and align CTE coursework?
So I think we've done pretty well, but I will also say we've been doing this for about 11 years, going on 12 years in North Carolina. So it's not really new for us. Back when we first started kind of diving into the deep end with this, we started pushing it as a way for students at the very least to prove that they can do something or that they know something. And so we've kind of couched it as that mentality. As Perkins 5 has really been kind of, COVID messed up Perkins 5 implementation. Okay, let's just be honest. It kind of wrecked everything that we had in the pipeline moving forward. And so our data has kind of gone a little bit all over the place. But last year was the first year that we really tracked concentrator earn rates of industry recognized credentials. And last year, what we learned is we had about 60,000 concentrators in North Carolina. And of that, only about 27% of them earned an IRC in the actual pathway that they concentrated in. And what we're presenting to our state board next week is that went up 10% over the past year. We're now at 30%, 37% earn rate. And we've got 68,000 concentrators. So we're very excited about that. We did choose IRCs as our program quality measure, in addition to some other things that we have, but also recognizing that for a number of years, North Carolina operationalized about 200 CTE state assessments where children were evaluated on their performance based on a 100-item multiple choice test. So to put forth an IRC as a measure of program quality and proof of learning for those children, that was anytime that you give children a chance to prove what they know instead of bubble in a bubble sheet, I think you're going to get some pretty positive progress.
Thank you, Trey. And Matt, I want to pose a question to you. David Alexander put in the chat that students gain confidence as they achieve industry certification. So what do you say? How does the research speak to this? And do you see that as a future research opportunity?
I absolutely see it as a future research opportunity. What I would love to do is look at survey data I think from an ideal research design perspective, I mean, ideally you could like assign students to different programs and kind of take out a lot of the other factors that might influence these things. But even if we could survey students at the beginning of their programs, survey them at the end of their programs, ask them some of these questions, I think that'd be a really critical line of research. My findings aren't super concrete or unassailable on this, but I'll just say when I've spoken to students and I went around and did some focus groups and interviews, one of the kind of ironies of my conversations with students was that when I eventually asked students, do you think you're going to pursue this field? Or do you think you're going to become a cosmetologist? Or you're going to go into construction technology or be a mechanic? Oftentimes the students would say no. However, at the same time, they spoke so highly of their CTE programs and felt as though they were developing those kind of workplace ready skills, that the students in the programs were just taking it so seriously that you kind of had to be an adult just to like not only just do well in the courses, but also prepare for the certification exam, because you're kind of doing it on your own time and you have to like manage your own time and effort. So it was very clear when I spoke to students that they were deriving so much value and their confidence was increasing in their own abilities. And they also spoke really highly of the culture of many of these programs, that it was a very different educational and pedagogical environment in these courses compared to many of the traditional academic courses. So I definitely don't want to discount that, because there's lots of psychological and social and non-test score, non-academic benefits that students are also deriving. Of course, I focused on things like earnings and college enrollment and stuff, which are very important. But I was really impressed at hearing about students' own personal development and the value they derive from the programs and from preparing for the certification specifically. So that's a great point. And I'm happy to hear that Jill has interviews in Texas and their students mirror that response. So we have some validation of that as well. So thanks, Jill.
I'd like to ask a question of Warren and Trey, and we'll start with Trey. In your state, how did students become aware that they could participate in these credentials or earn those credentials? And this comes from Susan Moyer.
Great. So I think what we've learned and experienced over the past few years in particular is as a school or a school district more tightly aligned themselves with the needs of the local business community through the Comprehensive Local Needs Assessment in Perkins 5. And that school makes a concerted effort to programmatically align those program offerings to business need. We see that students are becoming more and more aware. Businesses buy in more. There's much more of an interaction between the business and the local school. And I think that, I wasn't surprised when I saw the data about the school being the #1 item there. I think as the school buys in to IRCs, they promote them more, they offer them more, they publicize them more. And I think they just prepare children more effectively to be successful, because at the end of the day, that program leads to something in the local community, and that connection is pretty powerful.
Warren?
Yeah. So I think in Hawaii, the way students learn about their credential opportunities is really through their school, right? It's really through their 8th grade recruitment. They choose and most of our schools or a little over half our academy model. It's typically embedded within their program. So they're kind of, they're communicating about what the program includes, what the sequence is, what kind of jobs are typically out there, and then what kind of credentials they'll pick up along the way. So a lot of it is through school design, and that's how they learn about which one. Each of our schools are different. And unlike Texas, we're a very small state. So when you talk about regional areas, it's a little bit different, right? The island of Oahu consists of about 70% of our population. And the city of Honolulu, just in general, which is only like, 20 miles, not even 20 miles wide, is constitutes about 50% of our population already. So we do have rural remote areas, which I think the connection to local employers is good. But I think in Hawaii, we're always looking at, if we can't bring industry to the islands, how can we prepare our students for work outside or remote work or different types of options for those communities? So we don't have, like, say, I think the direct tie to like the employer in your general area is very different in Hawaii versus Texas, which is much more spread out. So schools make decisions on which academies, one based on student interest, based on local industry and state, and then align credentials along with that too. They've implemented a pathway advisory council to kind of shed some light on which credentials will be good for students. Now, I think we're in the discussion now, which ones are good for high school students versus which ones are valuable in industry. And how do we communicate that to our students? So, and I agree totally with everything that Matt was saying about how that builds confidence and what that does to their psychological benefits of academics in general. And I think there is a place for those credentials there. It's just how do we, I think the big mistake that we might make is how do we tell students that this is valuable, but make sure we communicate that value honestly. What I hate to do is tell students, this is super valuable. Okay, I don't need to go to college and I try to get a job. And then I'm sorry, that's not getting you a job. So I think we're working on how to better streamline some of that. And I think we have a lot of improvement that we can do.
For Matt and Amber, and we'll start with Matt this time, from Jennifer Wagner, and a few different pieces to this question. Who defines value? She's saying that her dissertation topic is on the value as defined by business, industry, and K-12 when it comes to IRCs. How do researchers, educators, business best identify value when it comes to IRCs are required by employment, EMT as an example? And Matt, the follow on is, do you break the healthcare related IRCs out from the group when analyzing data?
I'll answer the second question first because it's a little easier. And I'll say sometimes, depending on the specific analysis or model I was doing. So many of the figures that I showed did separate the subject of the certification. So I'm looking at like the specific type of certification students earned. But when I'm looking at like, did students earn any certification? I usually just combine them all together. Your insight is really valuable though, because health science were the most popular and health science seemed to be the most valuable. So one of the most valuable when you look at both post-secondary education and employment, it's possible that health science is having a disproportionate influence on our overall estimates of the benefits of certification. So separating health science out and comparing other ones, I think is a very important point. The other question is, once again, very complicated philosophically, politically, from a research perspective. And I think in my view, there isn't a clear and consistent definition of value, right? First of all, there's different methods for determining value. So you can look at actual outcomes, like did students get jobs, or how much were making, or how satisfied are they with the job that they have. You can look at job postings, which many have done to try to identify jobs that are aligned with different certifications. You can ask employers. I think asking employers is important, but I'm always a little bit concerned because, of course, employers have an incentive to say, we need so many more students with these certifications. But at times that, at least if that happens, that can just depress wages, right? If you have an undersupply of workers in a specific area, of course, employers have an incentive to say, we need more workers, because that broadens the pool of applicants, could allow them to keep wages low. So I don't think you can use any one method. I think combining different methods is important. But I do think the field should probably come up with different standards. Even something like, what is a reasonable salary or first year earning for students? In the report, the threshold we used was like 200% of the poverty line, right? Which was about $25,000 a year. Only about 5% of high school graduates were making above that threshold, right? So in other words, about 95% of students were making less than $25,000 a year. Now, some of the students were enrolled in college. Some of them were only working part-time. So, there's a lot of caveat and nuance around that. but I don't think that's a very high salary. And even that threshold seemed to be too high because only 5% of students were earning above that. So I do think we need to have some critical conversations about not just like on average, how much does this occupation make or how much do people with this specific certification make, but for recent high school graduates who earn that certification and try to get a job, how much are they actually making? And if they're all making close to poverty level wages, I don't think they're career ready, right? And I think we need to have a bigger discussion about what those standards should be. So we do right by students, and we don't, as Warren mentioned, give the perception to students that, oh yeah, you're ready for your career, when really students are kind of scraping by and trying to find a job, you know.
And I just underscore that point. I'm fascinated by this discussion in the chat about how different states are approaching hierarchies of IRCs. That's a point that we made in the report. And I like this point of having more than one way to think about value. I saw someone said, you know, we have entry-level IRCs, and then I think Warren was saying, well, we try to distinguish between IRCs that are helpful in industry versus IRCs that are helpful in school or the workplace. And you can see, you know, if you begin to have a hierarchy that says, okay, this is an entry-level IRC, this is a stackable one, this is one that, you know, really indicates mastery, which obviously you wouldn't be getting that in high school. But, you know, I mean, I would love to hear a little bit more about how states are thinking about hierarchies and talking about the different ways that IRCs are valuable and being able to communicate that, because when we just treat them all as one, you know, blob, so to speak, that's where we begin to lose a lot of the discussion and the debate, you know, because people can say, well, they're, you know, like, you know, we had to say, well, they're not a game changer. Okay, so how can we make them a game changer? How can we define them differently? How can we set expectations differently and communicate that? Because it's not like these are good, these are bad. You know, I mean, even when we were talking about Texas, and at one point, I think there was discussion of, you know, maybe cosmetologies, you know, shouldn't be considered a high value IRC. Well, that's not necessarily true, right? A cosmetology degree could be very valuable for some kids, especially if they're interested in that. And, you know, it's their life's dream. I mean, so I feel like we just don't, if we think about this in a little bit more sophisticated manner, then we're going to help kids make better decisions in their choices of IRCs and pathways.
And Trey, in the last minute, I do want to just kind of highlight and have you talk about your tier system in North Carolina, and also that your workforce agency helps you define the value.
Absolutely. So we're very fortunate here that we have such a great partner in the Department of Commerce that helps us do that labor and economic analysis and set a tier for each one of our credentials. We have 3 tiers. Those tiers also align to our bonus structure. Tier 1 credential, which might be something like a Microsoft Word, does not warrant a bonus. A tier 2, which might be something like Access or Revit, will warrant a $25 bonus to the teacher. And something like that would be more advanced would warrant a $50 bonus to the teacher. We'll be reporting on that in a week to our state board as well. And we're also lucky that we have another organization that tightly aligns with us on accomplishing our credential goals, and that's the North Carolina Workforce Credentials Council, which is kind of birthed as part of the My Future NC policy that our General Assembly has. That policy helps us aim for 2 million credentials of value earned by adults 25 to 44 by the year 2030. And we actually just discovered that we have about 47,000 of those from this year's population of NC students that have contributed to that number. So it's a significant opportunity for us in North Carolina.
Thank you, everyone. We are at the end of our session. I do want to please make sure you evaluate this session when you exit out of the webinar. It'll pop up the evaluation. Make sure you complete the evaluation. That this session also, I want to remind you that this session will be available on our webinars link on our page, and you'll see it dropped in the chat. I want to thank Amber, Matt, Warren, and Trey for being here today and for having this conversation. We probably could extend this for a few hours, but I appreciate everyone for dropping in and hearing our discussion, and that we will have future conversations and future research and work around this topic in the future. So thank you, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar, and have a fantastic day.
Thanks all. Thank you, Kevin.